I'm very, very impressed with everyone's punctuality. The very first order of business is that we are going to watch a very, very short, I believe 1 minute and 30 seconds long health and safety video. So Owen, do you want to?
Ladies and gentlemen, may we please have your attention for this public safety announcement. This is the main conference hall. The conference hall has 3 emergency exits. Exit signs will remain illuminated at all times. Please take a moment to check the exit nearest you, bearing in mind that it may be behind you. In the event of emergency, you will be asked to proceed to the exit and move up the stairs to the assembly point located in the lower castle yard beside the church. For your convenience, restrooms are located outside the main entrance to the room. Please ensure that mobile phones are switched to silent while in the conference hall, and remember that Dublin Castle is a no-smoking building. If you are using headsets, we would request that you return them to where you found them when you have finished. Welcome to Dublin, Ireland, and at its heart, Dublin Castle. For over 800 years, Dublin Castle has been at the centre of Irish political and cultural history. Please take time during your visit to tour around the castle, see Ireland's past in pride of place and memory, and enjoy the breathtaking art, furniture, and decor. Thank you for your attention, and enjoy your time in Dublin Castle.
Excellent. Well, good morning again. Una Carmody is my name. I am the Director of Arts Audiences, and I have a very few housekeeping kinds of announcements to make before we get going. The first thing is to say that we're here today in Dublin Castle through the good offices of the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, and I just want to acknowledge their generosity in interceding on our behalf and getting us the venue. In terms of the sessions today, I just wanted to make a couple of kind of technical announcements. So the first thing to say is that everything is being recorded. So we will have audio recording of each session today. The normal rule therefore applies, which is if you ask a question or make a contribution, it would be great if you said your name and the organisation that you come from, so that when we come to listen back. The other great thing about those recordings is we'll be able to see if there are good ideas, next steps. We'll be able to listen back to those and see. So we'll record those in that way. For the first session this morning and the touring session this afternoon, we're also on Google Hangout and on YouTube. So we have a number of people who will be watching and listening to us. This is our Twitter handle. We have a Twitter wall over here. We're encouraging people to obviously tweet throughout the day. And it would be really great if you could tweet your thoughts as you go through the day as well. I want to begin the session. This morning's session is being chaired by Martin Drury. Martin is the Strategic Development Director of the Arts Council. But my very pleasant job now is to simply introduce you. I'm sure many of you already know Orla McBride, who is the Director of the Arts Council. Orla.
Thank you very much, Una, and a very warm welcome to you all. And it's great to see so many people here, and I think it really is in recognition of how engaged all arts organisations around the country have become over the last number of years in the whole area of audience development. I particularly want to extend a warm welcome to our colleagues from the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. And as I say, really, your attendance here this morning is, I think, a very powerful affirmation of all of our commitments really to developing a growing and more diverse audience for the arts in Ireland. This event here, and I suppose it represents our partnership with arts audiences, really over the last number of years, I think it's about 7 or 8 years now, since the Arts Council, Una feels every bit of it, since the Arts Council really began to engage in the whole area of audience development, and developed a very strong policy commitment to audiences. And that really is because, as a public agency working in the public interest, continually reaching out in new ways to audiences, both existing and as yet to be connected to, is core to why we as an Arts Council exist. Very properly, we have a clear responsibility under the Arts Act to promote the arts. The arts, and I think artists by definition, are always in a conversation with the audience and with the public, and even at its most, I think, reflective, art is always an act of outreach. And because the audience is fundamental and building the audience is central to our role, over the last number of years, we have strategically intervened to support audience development. And I suppose Arts Audiences really is the most public expression of that commitment to audience development. And through Arts Audiences, and firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the incredible work that Una Carmody has done over the last number of years to really develop what is, I think, a very significant national programme, and also Gillian Clark most recently in supporting Una in her work. And through that partnership with Arts Audiences, we are working to promote cooperation and joint working between arts organisations. And I think even just this morning through the networking, you can see people who have begun to work together through a range of different interventions supported by Arts Audiences. We're facilitating and coordinating the gather of information, and the Kantar Media will be that first public presentation of some of the information that we have gathered through Arts Audiences. So really today is about us delivering to you, the sector, training to better meet your changing needs in the whole area of audience development. So throughout the day, we'll have presentations that we would have worked on over the last number of years. There will be a presentation of important work that we've done in the whole area of the visual arts, where 8 of our major galleries came together for a third year to gather demographic, behavioural and attitudinal information about audiences for the visual arts. For the second year, we have analysis of box office information from 6 of our literary festivals. There will be a presentation of the work that has been done in audience development for opera and companies who have been awarded opera project grants by the Arts Council. And finally, we'll have the Marketplace Initiative, which brings together 40 venues and producers to generate ideas, and partnerships for touring will be discussed. In addition to all of those presentations, there are a series of instructions where we can all learn practical things about how to market, about how to use social media, how to use images, and advocating for audience development in your organisation. We have encouraging evidence emerging that Arts Audiences training programmes are making a very real impact, and we hope that continued monitoring of these programmes show us where there are further needs that we as an Arts Council and Arts Audience have in terms of development. We have 1 year of data for 2013 where we can begin to compare box office results of venues and festivals who participated in audience development programmes in 2012 against other venues. And I think the really good news is that they perform better across 12 of the 20 markers compared to others. And key areas where they perform better include percentage capacity filled. So again, recognition that participating in training and being run by Arts Audiences absolutely impacts on your audience reach. In addition, our analysis of the impact of the programme of training for touring companies shows that all of the tours over the last 2 years who hit their audience target had done the training. It's hard work. Una will tell you that. It's a serious commitment, but the evidence is showing that it does work. There are other demonstrable impacts, of course, in respect of reported skills development, confidence and networking for all of those who have responsibility for audience development within their organisation. And today's event also seeks to build on all of these areas. One of the key elements of today's event for us is the publication of the Arts in Irish Life. I'm particularly delighted to have Christopher Larmour from Kantar Media here, and he is going to present the research and the analysis of the research that's been carried out. The Target Group Index Survey has carried out research for a number of years into arts attendances, and most of you have contributed to that over the last number of years. But in 2014, we commissioned some new material. to reflect and update some of the information from the Arts Council's landmark report, The Public and the Arts, in 2006, and we hadn't conducted a Public and the Arts since 2006, so we thought it was a really good idea to tag on to the TGI survey some additional questions. So we've restructured some of the attendance information so that the survey now asks specifically about aspects including attendance at arts festivals or the traditional arts. Without spoiling, I think, any of the results that you're going to hear in a moment, we can take great heart from the fact that Irish people continue to regard the arts as a prized asset and a valued part of Irish life. The analysis also points up to areas where more work remains to be done, and we will pay close attention to those results as we begin to plan in the Arts Council over the next number of years. Finally, I'd just like to say that we acknowledge in the Arts Council the very difficult resource circumstances which many organisations have had to endure over the last number of years. We know the difficulty of taking time out, even one day out of the office. So we want to thank you all very much for that. Being here, I think, is a significant commitment for very stretched organisations, but you're all here for a purpose. And as today will demonstrate, there is a gathering body of evidence clearly validating that systematic engagement with this agenda is a win-win for both arts organisations and for audiences. So I would like to sincerely thank you all for coming here this morning and for attending, but also for participating over the last number of years in so many of the Arts Audiences initiatives, surveys, data collections, etc. At times people find that, oh my God, I have to provide this information yet again to Arts Audiences or to the Arts Council. But it really helps us in advocating for more resources for the arts, but also in clearly demonstrating that, as I said, the arts are a very, very central part of Irish public life. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the day. And I'm now going to hand directly over to Martin Drury, Una, yes. And I will step down from the podium so that I can listen to Christopher. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. Fáilte Roibh agus. I'm just realizing we're clock already chasing the clock. So Orla has, unbeknownst to her, covered some of my ground, which is great. And the only thing that I thought in planting this thought, if it's not too early in the morning for a lofty thought, it is that in addition to, obviously, there'll be a lot of talk today, both in the helicopter that TGI will offer us, but also we get off that helicopter and into particular pieces of work around opera or literature or festivals or whatever, is that in a way this is, in addition to being a marketing conversation and an audience conversation, this is quintessentially a cultural conversation. And the reason I say that is that it's only when a work of art is engaged with by an audience, by the public, that it actually becomes meaningful. So in a way, this is a technical conversation, a business conversation, a marketing conversation, but it is also a cultural conversation. So Yeats is right when he draws our attention to the idea of how can we know the dancer from the dance. But in doing that, he's focusing entirely on the work of art. But if you take T.S. Eliot's view, he concentrates on the listener when he says, you know, listening so deeply, but you are the music while the music lasts. In other words, that the act of listening is an act of self-development. So I think that idea of when we bring the audience in, it's not just about box office and numbers, it's that in fact in bringing the audience in and the range of audience and their profile, where they're from, the demography, the socioeconomic profile, that actually enriches the meaning of art. So this is fundamentally a cultural conversation as well. And audience development is not just about numbers, though numbers are critical, it's also about the range of people, the range of experiences, and the range of ways in which people engage with the arts. But anyway, it's time to step into the helicopter. As Orla have said, we have added value this year in addition to the actual behaviors of the public. We've also looked at attitudes. It was too burdensome, too expensive in present moments to recommission the public and the arts, but we did want not too many years to pass so that we could read some trends and patterns. So there was a report in 1994, there was a report in 2006, And what we've added to the TGI brief was that in addition to the behaviours, the attendances, the engagements, they would also check out the attitudes. So TGI stands for Target Group Index. That's the helicopter you're about to climb into. But just to set the scene in relation to TGI, I'm going to invite Emer Faulkner from Kantar Media. She's the country manager for TGI, and it is she who manages, therefore, the relationship between TGI Ireland and its client base, which in this case includes arts audiences. Emer.
Good morning, everyone. Can I just firstly say that both Chris and I are delighted to be here today to present the findings of the Arts and Irish Life report. I suppose to firstly give you an idea of our planned agenda for this morning's session. I will start off with some introductions and give you some background about Kantar Media's TGI study from which the Arts and Irish Life report comes from. Chris then will talk to you about this year's study and give you a snapshot of the key findings from this report. We will end today's session with a Q&A. However, we welcome any questions that any of you may have throughout both our presentations this morning. So firstly, just to introduce our roles at Kantar Media's TGI survey. I, as Martin has said, look after the client base in Ireland. So I look after clients that are predominantly in Dublin and Belfast, and these are companies that are marketing and media companies. They're using the TGI for areas such as strategic insight, communications planning, and media planning. Chris's role then at TGI is on the research side. So Chris project manages the Irish surveys. So we have a Republic of Ireland survey and the Northern Irish survey as well. And at a European level, he's also managing a multi-country study of Great Britain, France, Germany, and Spain. So the Arts and Irish Life report, I suppose its overall purpose that we've been given from TGI's perspective is to create a major report on arts attendance rates at arts events in Ireland, and very much looking at the attitudes of Irish people towards the arts. So it was carried out by Kantar Media's TGI survey, and it was commissioned, we were commissioned by the Arts Audiences on Arts Council's behalf. So Target Group Index, to give TGI its full name. Just to tell you a little bit about it, for some of you in the room, you might be very familiar with TGI, but I think just for the benefit of everyone, I just want to explain a little bit about what it is and what it covers. It's firstly a single-sourced, syndicated consumer behaviour study. And the two TGI Irish studies are part of a global network of 70 different TGI markets. In terms of the ROI survey and its methodology, the TGI ROI data is released once a year, every September. And it's a nationally representative study of 3,000 adults. So when we talk about adults in TGI terms, we're talking about people who are aged 15 or over. There's 20 years of TGI Ireland data, so there is the scope to trend different consumer behaviour on the TGI. Our fieldwork each year happens throughout two ways. So we go into field in October of each year, and we finish of April of the following year. So the data pertaining to this report is related to those periods. We collect the data by way of a self-completion questionnaire, and the data then is weighted to the latest CSO estimate results each year. In terms of its coverage, I suppose TGI answers or aims to answer three broad questions. The first question is the who. So if we think about arts attenders, it's able to describe by way of demographics who those arts attenders are, but also arts attenders are different events. So looking at gender, age, social grade across the different regions in Ireland. It very much is a behaviour and attitudinal study as well. So thinking of those arts attenders, we can understand their attendance, so their frequency at different events, and also their recency. Attitudinally, TGI carries quite a large bank of attitudes. So again, with those arts attenders, we can understand what they're more likely to agree or also disagree with. So an example of an attitude in TGI might be, I consider myself interested in the arts. So we can quantify that agreement or disagreement with that statement. The how then is the third big question. And by how we mean how to reach these arts attenders. TGI prides itself in being media neutral. That means that we measure all different types of media, from digital to print readership to what we're watching on TV. So we're able to quantify and see what channels are the most effective in reaching arts attenders. In terms of our relationship with the arts audiences, it started back in 2011 when the first published report taken from TGI findings was published. And there's been an annual report since that point. I suppose working with Una at Arts Audiences, the report is aimed to quantify those arts attenders by understanding what different events, different types of people are going to, being able to profile each of those arts events, and understanding what other contexts they have across the entire spectrum of arts events we measure in TGI. I'm very much referring to that, how we saw in the previous slide, channel planning. So to understand what channels for you in arts organisations are the most efficient for reaching different types of people. This now brings me on to introduce Chris to talk about the 2014 study.
Morning. My role really for the next half hour or so is to try to give you a flavour of some of the results that have emanated from the survey this year. And I'm going to do so by focusing really on four elements. The first, as Emer mentioned, is that TGI is an attitudinal survey. And I want to showcase some of the new attitudinal statements we've added to the survey this year that have really enhanced our understanding of arts audiences. I'll also focus on the attendance and participation landscapes. And as Emer mentions, some of you will be familiar with the Arts Audiences reports produced annually. And what we'll do is give you a snapshot update of where those stand in 2014. And lastly, we'll come on to something that I think is one of the most interesting areas in the survey this year, looking at the factors, the influences, the stimuli that are driving people to either participate in the arts or indeed that inhibit participation. I think there are some very telling stories to be seen in the data in that respect. Now, I should admit up front, I'm a researcher. I love to deluge people with facts and figures, and there's definitely a research inclination to fill PowerPoint presentations with lots and lots of numbers. But before I succumb to that desire, I wanted to give you at least two figures that I'd love everyone to retain from this session. The first is 94%. 94% of the Irish public, adult public aged over 15, will have either attended an event, participated in some artistic activity, talked about the arts, or indeed watched or consumed media-related content focused on the arts in the last year. The second finding, in similar vein, 85% of the public will have expressed favourable opinions in respect of the arts. Now those are two big figures, and there's obviously a lot of nuance that lies within each of those. But it is worth saying from the get-go, there's significant evidence in the data that the Irish public are engaged with the arts. That engagement is significant and it's meaningful in terms of public perception of the arts. And what we'll come on to explain in terms of the detail, I hope will bear out those two findings further. I'm going to focus firstly then on public attitudes to the arts. Now, as Emer said earlier, the TGI is very much an attitudinal survey. We carry something in the order of 360 different statements on TGI, and those statements are related to people's perceptions of themselves, their interest in a particular category, their perceptions of social issues. And as part of the commission this year from the Arts Audiences, what we've done is to actually add a number of statements, 16 in total, focused very specifically on public perceptions of the arts. And by that we mean perceptions of the role of the arts, we mean the significance people attach to the arts relative to other categories of public life, and we also mean people's opinions on issues such as funding. And in the case of TGI statements, we're talking about a 5-point agreement scale. So you either definitely or tend to agree, definitely or tend to disagree, neither agree or disagree in the middle. I'm going to take you through really just three sets of statements that have emanated from the 2014 results. The first are very much the headlines. So we've two figures on the left. Those are both any agreement levels. And they show firstly that 85% of the population agree that arts draws people to Ireland, draws tourism and visitors to the country. And a similar proportion, 78%, agree that the arts also gives us an optic onto other cultures. I have a further two figures on the right that show as well as valuing the arts in a general or abstract sense, the data also tells us that people believe the arts is relevant today. 71% indicate they believe it important in a modern society such as Ireland, and 68%, a slightly lesser number, indicate that today's art and artists matter as much as legacy art. Now, those are our headlines and very much the general statements on the role of the arts. I won't dwell on this slide particularly. One of the things TGI does allow us to do is look at the profile of people agreeing with a statement. Now, as you might expect for statements that conduct majority support, a statement such as the arts play an important and valuable role in Ireland sees agreement from all parts of the population. So the gender split is much like that of the population. And similarly, we're seeing all age groups agreeing with a statement of that nature. That's some of the general statements. We also asked very specific questions that qualify the role of the arts relative to other categories. So as you can see, we ask what importance people attach to arts amenities relative to sports amenities, and equally what value is attached to arts in education relative to, for example, science education. And here again, we're seeing very strong majority support on both of those statements. 63% of people agreeing with the first, 76% with the second. And indeed, that second figure would have been higher, but for the fact that those in education, particularly young men, seem to respond negatively to that second statement. Turning then to the issue of funding and money, we see in the first statement at the top of that slide that 60% of the population indicate that even in the current economic circumstances, they believe that central government, local authorities should maintain their funding for the arts. I put two other figures in this slide for a reason. When we ask people about their personal sense of funding and funding priorities, we see that just over 50% will agree that it is fair to pay an entry fee to, for example, museums or galleries. And I think that's quite a pertinent issue given recent issues around supporting, for example, museums. And although that's strong support, it's worth qualifying it with the last statement. People say that they can't afford to attend all the arts events that they would like to. And it's interesting, therefore, that they are keen to support the arts, but do acknowledge the pressure on funding at present. Before I leave the area of attitudes, I wanted to focus just on two last figures that will relate to the attendance and behavioural landscape. TGI conducted a multi-country attitudinal overview study this year. So we took about 50 statements and looked at them across 50 different markets globally. And one such statement is this: I consider myself to be interested in the arts. We can see that over on the left-hand side of the slide, you've got China and the States, where any agreement with that statement is roughly around the 50% mark. Typically speaking, you've got the Western European countries from 30% down to 20%. I'll show you just one other figure before I comment on that. And this is from our own The Public and the Arts Study 2014. Shows that 42% of people indicate the arts don't play a significant part in my life. Now, on the surface, that's probably not the figure to present to a group like this. The reason I raise it is twofold. Firstly, when we look at that group, that 42%, we actually see that a good number of those people, about 50%, actually do attend arts events in a reasonably significant manner. What we seem to see at the level of attitudes is that there is a group of people who don't necessarily self-identify as engaged with the arts, but nonetheless are in a very meaningful way and are therefore a very meaningful constituency for this audience. The reason I put up the first slide on interest in the arts is this. It isn't simply that group who are expressing favourability in the attitudinal statements that we've showcased. The group, the 42% who believe the arts isn't significant to them personally, tend to have the same levels of agreement to statements related to the role, function, and importance of the arts. So what we're seeing very much across those statements is, firstly, the arts are valued by all segments of the population. They're judged concretely important relative to other things. So these aren't simply abstract valuations, abstract agreements. And what we're also seeing is that that agreement traverses all groups. It's both attenders and it's non-attenders. That value is seen by the public as a whole. I want to turn now just to the attendance landscape. I say a lot of you will be familiar with the detailed version of these reports produced annually. And I certainly don't want to touch on all of that detail today. For those who might not be familiar, we cover a range of event types on the TGI at present. For example, we'll cover plays in terms of theatre, stand-up comedy, dance performance, art festivals, art exhibitions. In summary, we measure 23 different event types, and in each case, we'll try to capture the frequency with which people attend. We'll try to capture when they last attended, and indeed what country those attendances were linked to. So certainly a lot of detail, and for those who have access to TGI, I would urge you to interrogate that further. The headline statistic that arises from that data is this: 64% of the Irish population will have attended at least one arts event in the last 12 months. And in this context, we mean by arts events any of those 23 items listed. We mean arts festivals, and we also mean cultural cinema. It's worth saying in this case, we haven't included mainstream cinema, and I know the Public in the Arts 2006 would have measured that also. If we're to add that figure in, we see that 85% of the population will have had an interaction with an arts event in the last year. So again, a very strong, very important figure. Now, some of you will discern I've got a Northern Irish accent, so the next slide pains me, but is something I've observed over many years looking at TGI data, that actually not only is arts attendance robust in the Republic of Ireland, but it is also typically higher than in a lot of other territories. So for example, on a like-for-like basis to the 64%, we see that Northern Ireland will have 51% attendance in the last year, and Great Britain 47%. One of I think the key findings that arises from this year's results is plotted on this little timeline. So we're able to look at TGI snapshots year by year, and I've plotted a couple of arts events on that map. And if we take the top line, you can see that plays back in TGI 2009, so period 08-09, reached approximately 30% of the population. And there was a period of 2 or 3 years in the arts reports where we would have said that we were witnessing decline, and that our perception was certainly that that was linked to the economic circumstances. There is, I think, therefore, something of a promise in the figures from TGI 2012 onwards, that what we're seeing is incremental regrowth in a range of arts events. And that's not just growth at a general level. It's interesting to note as well that when we look at the groups who are driving that growth, it's actually lower to middle income respondents who appear to be trading up their attendance from light to medium attendance in many cases. I think there's something very interesting that lies within those figures. I don't intend to go through every event, although I'd urge you after the session in the Q&A to ask if you've specific interests. This year, we've measured a number of new events to ensure that we're overlapping with the coverage which was on the Public in the Arts 2006. For example, that's meant adding musicals, variety, stand-up comedy to the theatre set. And what we're seeing just on the right is that those figures hold very close to the estimates that were made in the Public in the Arts 2006. So we're seeing the TGI figures really independently verifying a lot of what was said in that prior report. We've also had named arts festivals for the first time to the TGI. And again, for those who are managing events of that sort, we have some very detailed level information which can help guide you on who your audiences may be. Similarly, just to complete the coverage set, you can see again that we're measuring, say in total 23 items, and we've added a number of important new art forms this year. I want to highlight two of these. The first is traditional or folk music, and the second traditional or folk dance, measured on the Public in the Arts and measured again on our 2014 study. What you can see here is that 21% of people will have attended a folk music, traditional Irish folk music event in the last year. Almost 1 in 5, just over 1 in 5 rather. And traditional folk dance getting 10% reach in the last year. Very significant interest in the Irish arts, as well as a general interest from the Irish population. Again, one of the things TGI allows us to do is to ask the question, who are those people, both relative to the general public, but also relative to people who are interested in that form of art in general. So if we take the example of folk dance events, we see that actually that group is somewhat more male than I might have expected before seeing the results. There's certainly a rural bias, and I think that was more expected, and something of an older age bias. I certainly wouldn't overstate that latter point. What we see is a very important young constituency within attendance to that event as well. And again, I think that promises much for the future. So that's us to the halfway point. That covers attitudes, and it also covers a little flavour of what we cover in terms of attendance. I wanted to turn now to participation. Participation in TGI terms, we ask people about their hobbies and interests. Indeed, we ask an array of questions about how they spend their leisure time. And in this case, we ask people whether in the last year they were regular or occasional participants in various artistic or creative activities. So to give you a little sense of the list, we ask, for example, whether you sing in a choir, whether you sing for pleasure, whether you are someone who paints, sculpts, or dances. So we have a set of approximately 20 such events. What we see is that 36% of the population will be participants in what we would term artistic or creative activities. And indeed, I would suggest that in a way that list is perhaps limited. It doesn't necessarily capture, for example, digital artistic behaviors, digital creativity, curating your own Instagram site or whatever it may be. In trend terms, what we see with participation is that unlike attendance, it is a much more stable variable. Attendance tends to vary significantly according to economic circumstance. Participation from the TGI results is something that has been much more stable over time. And indeed, when you look at the Northern Irish results to the right on that table and the GB results, we're seeing very comparable proportions of the population who will engage with those participative activities. As a researcher, there's one thing I don't like, and that's the odd figure, the figure that doesn't make sense straight away. So I've just said that participation has been stable, has been largely stable for the decade that I've been looking at TGI figures. when we look at one of our attitudinal statements, I consider myself to be to be a creative person. We see something that looks more like a decline, and certainly between 2012 and 2014, a more notable decline in agreement. And that certainly caused us to look further at the figures. What we're seeing again, a little bit like the statements we showcased earlier, is that there is a group of people who indicate that they disagree, they don't consider themselves creative, but are themselves participants, are themselves attendees of the arts. Typically speaking, they don't talk about it, so their word of mouth value, as we would term it, so the extent to which they talk about the arts is significantly lower than the average. So again, I think there's if we call it a hidden constituency, a group of people who we might undervalue if we take the figures in too superficial a manner. And again, I think that's an important point to bear in mind with all these figures. The other question that I guess get asked a lot, certainly when we measure all of these factors together of the same respondent, is whether there's a relationship between attendees and participants. So I've put up a table, which I think just needs a little bit of explanation. So on the left, I've plotted people's weight of attendance. So from the bottom, whether they don't attend, through to people who are attending at least once a month or more often. On the other axis of the table, I've plotted whether someone is a participant regularly or occasionally in any of those artistic activities. Now in TGI, we talk about correlations a lot. So I've put figures in this table which are index values. They express the likelihood, above or below a figure of 100, that that group has that particular behavior. So just to qualify that, the figure of 215 I've circled says this. It says that regular participants in artistic activities are 115% more likely than the average to also be heavy attenders of arts events. Now, that figure in itself is interesting, and perhaps no surprise that there is a correlation between those two things. What's interesting in the data is when you run the same analysis by younger respondents, by those aged 15 to 24, you see a much stronger correlation. You see that, in fact, for those young people, someone who is an attendee is 150% more likely to also be a participant, and vice versa. So there's something that we could call it a halo effect connected to the arts. If someone is engaged on one of those dimensions, it is likely to introduce them to the others. And again, that's very interesting in terms of talking about outreach and building an audience. The last section then I wanted to cover, I've sort of generically badged as influences. We ask a lot of questions on the survey about the factors that drive your behaviour. So in the context of the arts in Irish life, we've asked questions about the difficulties people have with attending arts events that they would like to participate in. We ask people also, well, how did you find out about the arts events you wanted to go to? How satisfied were you with that information? So we have a wealth of indicators external to the respondent, which show where they're getting their information and what's driving them to attend or participate. The first one, to start on the negative, we talk about inhibiting factors. We talk about the things that people state are difficulties to them taking part. Approximately 30% of people will say that in the last year they have had some difficulties in taking part, attending or taking part in the arts that they would be interested in otherwise. And the public in the arts told, I think, a very similar story in this respect. It said that there are two key factors here, really. One is cost, invariably. The other is time. So you can see at the top of this list, 13% of people indicated that cost was the determinant factor. Beneath that, in the orange, you see that family commitments, lack of time, other difficulties to find time are are also key difficulties according to the population. I think there's two facets of this data that are very interesting. The first is that when we ask this question, people don't tick one box only. People will tend to indicate 2 to 3 different difficulties in each case. What it suggests very much is that there is a complex of factors that will inhibit someone from taking part, and there isn't necessarily one brick wall that's stopping them. I think what's also interesting and indicated in the data is how those difficulties vary by different target groups. So we're target group index, and we often talk about different demographic sets. So in TGI parlance, we talk about fledglings being young people, pre-family, pre-marriage, 15 to 34. And when you look at the difficulties that over-index for that group, they're saying 2 or 3 factors stand out for them. Typically speaking, they're indicating that their peer group, whether their friends are involved, matters to them. They also express a concern about being uncomfortable with whatever event they might attend. And time, lastly, is a factor they state. That varies then as you go through different life stage groups. Parents are one of the groups who invariably have a very low attendance profile in the data. And when you look at the difficulties they cite, that's perhaps to be understood. Time factors are really the key determinant for that group. And that's quite often finding the time, but it's also peripheral linked issues like transport, for example, or accessibility, which are often cited. Lastly, just to take another group at the other extreme of the set, we talk about empty nesters. So these are individuals, male and female, over 55 years of age, who may have had children, but those children will have left home and are otherwise independent, typically married. Empty nesters, the issues that stand out for that group are often, again, around access. They may be health concerns, they may be relatively practical concerns quite often. One of the interesting factors that stands out for this group is actually a feeling that they might be out of place or uncomfortable as well. That indexes as highly as it does for that young, often teenage group. And that's certainly a facet that we wouldn't have predicted before fielding these questions. Just very much in the same spirit, we look at where people attend arts events, so the setting, and we list a range of venues, both formal venues, but also public or civic spaces or local spaces. And I've highlighted 3 or 4 which are public civic spaces. And you can see that the community centre, the school hall, the library, all factor quite significantly in the data individually. Again, thinking back to those target groups we've just described, what also stands out is that when you compare the target groups to the places that they're attending the arts, those civic spaces become much more important for those groups. The community centre in particular is very important for those empty nesters. The school, the library are important destinations for parents in terms of the arts. So there's a group who may not have a very visible formal presence at arts venues, but nonetheless are participating and are participating at a local level. I'm almost finished deluging you with figures, so bear with me for a few more minutes. Thinking now about positives, so we've talked about inhibiting factors. Again, much like the figure we threw up on participation and attendance, we ask a number of questions about the proportion of your family and the proportion of your friends who are likely themselves to take part in certain arts events. And without putting the formal figures up for this, what we find is that there is a correlation between your likelihood to attend events and the degree, especially to which your friends, or the proportion to which your friends are likely to take part. So again, there's a halo effect there. Having a connection to the arts of any sort tends to return additional benefit. And just one last one on positives, and I hope pleasing for people in this room. We ask people about their satisfaction levels with information on particular events, on particular venues. And actually, as you can see from the figures, an overwhelming majority are indicating themselves satisfied or very satisfied when asked that question. Indeed, as Emer explained right at the start, we allow you to dig into which channels of information those people are using as well. I've highlighted two which are notably different, I think, from the public in the arts. Invariably, the internet has grown significantly in importance since the 2006 report. Although I think that's important, I would sound one note of caution in respect of that figure, and that's this. When you take those people who are using internet as their channel for information, and indeed are heavy internet users themselves, we tend to see a bit of polarization in terms of their satisfaction scores. There does seem to be a proportion of people who are what we would call digital natives, who seem less satisfied at present with the arts information they're getting. The other one that I would stress simply is word of mouth. Again, harking back to what we said about the importance of recognizing local behaviors, we see that actually word of mouth, the billboard, still matters significantly. People are getting their information at a local level and are being driven to some of those arts events. That, I appreciate, is a lot of detail, and those four sectors are necessarily interdependent. And the report that we're going to publish will hopefully delve into a lot more of the detail connected with each. In terms of where we are, where we go next, as I say, I hope what we've been able to show you is just that there's a lot of information that we've collected as part of the arts in Irish life. The TGI itself is vast in terms of its coverage. And I hope that means that if you have a particular question, a particular target group that you're looking at, we have some of the information that hopefully adds to that investigation or inquiry. As things stand, we hope then, this has been the teaser, if you like. We hope that the full report will be on its way in the next week or so. As I say, we do have the ability to look into those figures further as part of the Q&A to answer some questions you may have on the themes we've raised. And we also have the opportunity, I think, to extend this conversation further. We do measure arts and leisure interests in the TGI and will continue to do so over time. And from our perspective, it'll be interesting to see whether that picture of a very vibrant sector continues next year and beyond. Now, I just a very last point before I turn to Martin. It's not the reaction I was expecting. I think it's a lovely photo. It's always it's always judicious to thank your moderator before he starts a Q&A, but I would like to pay a particular thanks to Una and to Martin for their help in preparing the Arts in Irish Life questionnaire, their scrutiny of the results, and all of their input into the report. It's certainly been invaluable for both Emer and I trust that the end report is something that will interest a lot of you in the room today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was really measured in that it's almost as if your delivery is exactly an analogy for the sort of thorough, measured exploration of the issues. And I think also, which bears out one of the points that Orla was making, is the value of building this over years allows you to get nuanced and trended information, so one can start to see patterns. I could do a quick survey now, and the key question would be, how many conferences have you been to where at the first session they say, well, look, we've completely run out of time for the Q&A, but that was a fascinating discussion, but let's you can talk amongst yourselves at coffee. But actually we are in the very opposite and pleasant position of having a goodly, good half hour, 30, 35 minutes to explore some of what Chris has given to you. I know it's difficult to absorb, but I think it would be a missed opportunity not to unpick some of the attitudes. There are roving microphones. There are two roving microphones. There are two people with two roving microphones. So, in the spirit of what Una said, if you could identify yourself before you ask your question, or indeed make your observation, and there'll be special bonus points for the first brave soul to lift a hand. Hey, bonus point for you.
But it won't make any difference. So, can I just, sorry, I have to say my name, don't I? Sarah Webb, Mountains to Sea Book Festival in Dún Laoghaire. I had two questions. I'm the children's curator there, so I'm particularly interested in children and families. So the parents figure. Did you, in the research, did you ask the parents, did they attend arts events with their children? That's my first question. And my second question is, in the arts participation, there was no mention of reading or even writing. And I was wondering, did you ask people as well as going to the cinema, going to the ballet, did they read?
I don't know if this is, yeah. So on the first of those questions, unfortunately, that linkage in terms of parents bringing children isn't covered at present on the survey. But I certainly think that is one area that is well worth further coverage. One of our other TGI studies does look at parent and child in terms of the influence in both directions on behaviours and leisure interests. On the second, we do actually cover reading, and indeed reading with children. So it's one for the coffee break maybe, but we have some figures in that respect that might be interesting, and we can certainly show those to you.
Thank you.
There's a gentleman there. Thank you.
Just curious, my name is Carson Imram, Irish Language Literature Festival. Was there any questions asked? You said there was additional detail. Were there any specific questions about language, specifically cultural events in the Irish language? See, we're talking about the arts and Irish life. There wasn't one single mention of the Irish language, or for that matter, other languages. There are people who speak Polish, Cantonese, etc. in this country. Is there any detailed information on that? And if there isn't, why not? And would you look at those issues in the future, maybe?
Yep, well, the survey does cover languages spoken, and indeed in terms of Gaelic, it will cover both an ability to speak it, to read it, and I think there's a third factor, listen. So it's much as the census question, actually. What we don't ask presently is the degree to which you attend specific arts events which have an Irish language focus. So as your question suggests, that perhaps is one area we can dig into further. What the figures show, though, especially on those two figures we showcased for traditional Irish or folk events, that actually there is a correlation there between those with an Irish language interest and those participating or attending events in that space. So there is some interesting data to be drawn out from that overlap, especially.
Please. Yes.
Thanks. Pippa Little, Limerick Arts Office. I was just wondering, those figures are all based on self-completion questionnaires, which my understanding is people tend to slightly overstate what they think you want to hear on. Have you other stats, or have you any other studies, even internationally, where people have looked across other figures and tried to figure out, well, is this all slightly skewed upwards?
It's a good question. I suppose in any research, of course, there is a risk for bias. So, for example, the Public and the Arts would have been a face-to-face survey. And when, for example, an interviewer asks the question, do you like the arts? Are you interested in the arts? We saw when it was asked face-to-face, 70% of people would have agreed. As self-completion, if anything, in our experience, certainly has tended to yield what we think to be slightly truer responses. I'm a researcher, so I'm bound to say this. There's great value in doing lots of research of different types. because I think across those different surveys, you see the truth. The truth emerges from the layers of those data results. Internationally, we certainly look across countries, and we certainly notice differences in how people respond to attitudinal questions country by country. And that's one of those factors that is hard to remove from many of the results that we've shown you today.
And just as we're waiting for another question, is there, I mean, that's the format of the question, the self-completion versus the face-to-face interview, but is there a difference also between the single issue survey and that issue buried within a wider set of questions about whatever attitudes and behaviors?
Again, I'm sure I'm relatively skewed in saying, yes, there's great value in putting it on TGI, but I do think actually our survey is about people's general behaviors across a very wide spectrum of activities. I think because of that, we're not leading them into the arts as a particularly significant section. We're not saying to them, look, we think this is important, now tell us the same thing. So the fact that what we're getting back is significant agreement, I think it is very pleasing.
There's a question at the back. There's two, maybe three now. So just wherever the nearest hand is, and then you might pass the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, Lucy Medlicott from the Irish Street Art Circus and Spectacle Network. I just two questions again. The first question is, can you tell us a little bit more about how you actually got the people that filled in the service? I know you said they came from urban, from rural, from different age groups,
Sure.
but from different social backgrounds. You know, how do you find them? How do you pick them? How many people?
Okay. So I won't try to bore you all with methodology for half an hour. We are a quota sample survey, so we recruit from CATI, what we call telephone interviewing, randomly selected numbers, and about 65 to 70% of our sample will come from random digit dial. A further 5% will come from recontacting people who have done surveys for us in the past. The remainder is face-to-face, and we use face-to-face interviewing to make sure we get the most difficult to reach groups. So for example, younger respondents will typically be less amenable to phone surveys. So we've used a mix of methods really to make sure we are nationally representative. And as Emer mentioned at the start, the other thing we do then is weight and control all our figures to be nationally representative. And that's on a number of axes. It's certainly gender, age, it'll be region, and it'll be some of the interlocking combinations of those things. So TGI is widely used, certainly in the media and marketing industry. And we're very careful to make sure that the survey is controlled in a robust way year in, year out.
Does it hit different social backgrounds? That's really what I want to know.
Yeah, our evidence, including metrics that we don't release, is that it does. Now, again, I'd be foolish not to say that as it's a self-completion questionnaire, it's quite a large questionnaire, and that inevitably is going to produce some biases in the people who are likely to respond. What we do is try to minimize those limitations by making sure, especially, that we incentivize the groups who are hardest to reach and make sure they are taking part in the survey.
Okay, and my second question is, I'm delighted and excited to hear that you're adding new art forms to the list, and particularly traditional arts, but also arts festivals. And I know you said you have more data about the arts festivals, so I'm wondering, does that include street arts, circus, and spectacle? Because we, as the lobbying advocacy body for this sector, are particularly interested in the audience numbers for this, and it's very hard to track, as you know. And I know in the UK they're doing a lot of research around outdoor arts, and I know you mentioned that you have outdoor venues on your list, the civic spaces and so on. So have you got figures on that? And
unfortunately, the survey this year probably doesn't go as far as we'd like it to cover that. So encounter with arts in public spaces. So I know the Public in the Arts 06 would have covered that. And it isn't currently on the TGI list. But again, one of the things we want to take from today is our suggestions on where we can expand our coverage. So we'll certainly bear that in mind.
Just as the mic's being passed, I think it's worth saying that to some extent TGI are delivering according to a brief, and that brief is to some extent set by Arts Audiences and the Arts Council. There's a balance to be struck between adding more and more carriages to the train to the point where the train actually collapses under the weight of expectation. So if you are doing a fill-in questionnaire that's multidisciplinary, including the arts, then you have to be careful not to overweight it. And secondly, we were also conscious of trying to track over time. So if you keep changing the questions, you don't actually begin to reveal the patterns and the trends. So there's always a line to be walked on that. But I mean, I'm hearing from those first two questions in relation to the language, or in relation to children and families, or now in relation to street arts and spectacle, a hunger. And I suppose it's just, perhaps we'll find some means of harvesting that set of desires. Just before the next person asks the question, I should have said this earlier, there's unfortunates who are squatting on the floor, and there are comfortable seats up here. So if you want to move from your uncomfortable squatting to a comfortable seat, please do feel free to do that. Now, the microphone hopefully is with somebody else.
Yeah, here.
Please.
Hi, Aoife Flynn from the Irish Museum of Modern Art. I was interested in, I suppose, drawing threads, and then there was a question at the end between a couple of your findings around participators being heavy attenders, and then the sort of apparent finding about people's self-definition as creatives, of that declining. And you had mentioned that it doesn't seem to look at the question around digital engagement. And then I'm particularly interested in digital natives and audience development in that area, which is where the question is coming from. And I suppose with all of that in mind, and then with the result that digital natives are more likely to find that the online information from arts organisations is not satisfactory to them. I'm just wondering, do you have some comment around that? I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, there would be findings where we are increasingly becoming more creative, and that digital is unlocking that for a lot of the younger fledglings, I guess, as you term them. So if we're looking at that audience as a growing audience, and we want them to be participators so that they will be heavy attenders, and their behaviour online is to be participatory, that's sort of what they need. Is there just some findings in there that would help guide that thought process within Ireland?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing I should say is that although there's something of a skew towards dissatisfaction for those digital natives, they are still largely satisfied. So we're just saying a slightly higher index, a higher level of correlation there. So I firstly wouldn't maybe sort of overstate the negative. I suppose the reason we mentioned digital as a particularly interesting space is that there's other pieces of research that I'm sure people in this room may be aware of, especially say in the States. I've seen a recent report which has asked that question. It is odd that when you ask some of the formal measurements of arts attendance or participation, you're getting decline. And yet when we walk around the street, we see people who have curated their own music list on their iPod, who are on Instagram or on Twitter. And how should we classify behaviors online in terms of capturing those who are creative in that space? And that's a measurement challenge that I pose, but don't necessarily have the answer to at the moment. So I think there's lots to be looked at for that group. They are an interesting group in their media habits. They are certainly an interesting group in that they will tend to express more concerns about how to get involved in the arts. I suspect probably what TGI leaves people with is a set of questions about that group, to which in a way maybe other research, and particularly qual research, can often provide some of the richer answers. So I'd suggest what I leave you with, maybe slightly unsatisfactory, is just a set of further questions in that space.
Yes, please.
Hello, Sarah Boiling from the Audience Agency in London. Just one
comment to the person that asked about the levels of bias in self-completion questionnaires, and certainly when we've compared what people say in surveys with what actual box office data says they really do, there is an over-reporting of frequency. People are definitely committed and keen and enthusiastic, but they don't actually attend quite as often as they say they do. It's hard to be precise and put, say it's 20% because it varies, but there's definitely a gap there. But my question is, I was really interested in what you said about there's a group of people who don't necessarily self-identify as artistic or creative, yet they are going to arts events. Can you tell us any more about the profile of who these particular people might be? Because I think that's really potentially a really interesting group.
Yeah, well, certainly I think it does stand out as interesting. As you say, there is, if not a contradiction, a group who aren't explicitly declaring themselves engaged. The report will look at some of the detail on this. What we started by doing is just looking at, well, what was their attendance profile? What was to what extent did they talk about the arts? To what extent do they support them? And what we were saying was those people who disagree, or who say, I'm not creative, in effect, their attendance is usually light to medium. Their favorability is usually strong to those sort of top line, I believe the arts is important. Typically speaking, they're lower in terms of their peer group being engaged with the arts. They're lower in terms of talking about the arts themselves. They tend to be occasional participants rather than regular. Demographically, I don't have the exact detail with me. Certainly men are the worst for this phenomenon, in truth, at contradicting themselves in research. And there is something of the... just imputing myself, really. There is something of, we saw men 35 through to 54 who are perhaps don't expect to have to acknowledge themselves as engaged with the arts. There's something there, perhaps. And again, it's the limitation of TGI that although we pose those statements and frame the problem, we can't really get to the core of the sentiment behind that.
Thank you, Chris. There may be questions there. I'm just going to, in case this side of the room gets distressed, there's two people here. I'm going to go, yes, I'll take you after the lady, please.
Hi, I'm Monica Sapielak from the Center for Creative Practices in Dublin. We work with migrant, experimental and emerging artists. So our biggest challenge is to attract audiences to events and artists who they've never heard before about. So do you have any data about people trying out new genre, or how often do they go to something they don't know, they are not familiar with, and what might be the obstacles, or what would help this engagement?
What we do have is a set of lifestyle statements which are all about propensity to try new things. So I think we have a statement, especially around leisure, I like to try out or experiment with new things. So what?
Interested in other cultures, or
absolutely.
All assuming, attitudinal statement.
So what we can do at a very headline level, not specific to arts, is talk about people who like to go out, like to experiment, like to be there with friends, so to form some of those clusters who are your likely audience, and from that then work down to the detail and actually look at their arts complexion as is. So it's a little bit indirect, but I think what we can talk about is general attitudinal positions, and from there try to enrich the picture. So I think there probably are a few things that would speak to that question.
Can I add something to that? If you can hear me, which is that the main report that we publish every year looks at people who are very frequent arts attenders and their media behaviour. So how are people who are very frequent attenders, who I would imagine are people who are also most likely to take chances or would have, that would be part of their behavioural profile. So
the main report also looks then at how do those people find out, what media do they consume, and how do they find out whatever they find out about the arts. So I think the main report, which is published every year, would really help with that as well.
Yes, there's a couple of people at the back, and I'll be with you, but there's a gentleman here. And I think I might have abandoned somebody down here. All those hands that went up originally, is there anybody that I didn't pick up? No. Okay, sir.
Hi, I'm Fergus Hannigan from the Abbey Theatre. It was very promising to see the growth in attendance this year, particularly in plays, and it's something we've been experiencing ourselves. But what I wanted to get your opinion on was, where's the real opportunity for audience development over the coming years? Is it in adding new people to the arts audience, or is it in increasing frequency amongst existing people?
I suppose it's a good question. The remit of this study, firstly, is really to measure the as-is. Typically, in research terms, the way we'd approach a question like that is to actually segment the market and talk about people who perhaps, have an arts engagement and interest, but whose attendance is low currently, or try to identify those different opportunity sets. Now, that's something at present we haven't done. What we have seen typically when we think backwards is that certainly the patterns of attendance are such that it's not converting people from not to attendees. What we see typically is modulation between light and medium attendance levels as being the most significant driver year on year of difference. Whether that's singularly the only opportunity in terms of growth, that's a larger question which we don't currently look at.
But I think between the work that these guys have done and the Aero study, and I know the presentation later on today links the TGI data with the mapping your audience to venues, but also this information tells us, for example, the age profile of every artist. If you look at the age profile of attenders at every art form, it takes that parental dip in every single case. So not only are we able to look at whether people are, frequent attenders, and can we convert them into very infrequent attenders, and can we convert them into more frequent attenders, but it's also a very rich area of exploration to look at, well, where are the likelihoods that people will attend at particular stages in their life or geographic areas or whatever kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Just test the acoustic. Did my squatter friends get that? Yeah, very good. Okay, so there's two or three people at the back of the hall. Thank you. Certainly a gentleman there. Yes, thank you.
Pádraig Naughton from Arts and Disability Ireland. I'm curious to know if you have been able to look specifically at people with disabilities, either in terms of the trends of the types of arts events that they attend. Are they different to non-disabled people? And then also in terms of media and what media channels they are using to find out about the arts.
Yes, so the simple answer is exactly that. We do measure disability on the TGI survey, or we ask for it to be reported. What that means, it wasn't showcased in this presentation, but we can take a specific target group and look at how their behaviors differ. I don't have with me at present exactly how that complexion differs from the general population, but that is something that the figures that Una has each year from TGI can inform, and it'll certainly form part of the report that we're due to publish. So the ability is there to look at it. In terms of specific sort of channel planning, what we do usually then is take an aggregate of 2 or 3 surveys so that we've got a large population within that target group to look at. And then we can really say just where there are differences or biases in media usage for any given group. And that's certainly the sort of investigation that we can do. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bannon. I'm from the Arts Council. I was interested in the question that you, or the figure around public attitudes about public spending in the arts. And I just wondered in your wider research how that compared maybe to other areas of spending like health or sport, or how people's attitudes compare to those other areas.
I should admit there's a limitation to what we've measured in that certainly we've added these specific questions on funding for the arts. What we have are those couple of relative questions about arts versus sports amenities, arts versus science education. I think what comes across from those questions, which are around finance in a sort of general sense, is we saw from the difficulties question that actually financing cost matters to people at a personal level. And what's interesting in the data, therefore, is that those people who are saying, I can't afford to attend events myself, or indeed are reported as coming from a lower income group, are agreeing that funding matters. I think that's one of the big findings from this report. So we don't have that question replicated across different categories, but what we do have is evidence that although I can't afford to do X, it matters to me that this sector is still important and funded. And that comes across really strongly in the data.
Yes, the gentleman there, and then I'll come to you next. Yeah.
Dahi Ramsey and Green and Theatre in Letterkenny. I was struck by the difference in sentiment in rural areas to urban, which suggests in part we've our work cut out in rural venues. But I was just wondering if more of the report breaks down in that way. Do you break it down in terms of rural and urban? For example, in terms of obstacles to go in and where people get their information from?
We do, absolutely. So I know the Public in the Arts 2006 would have spoken to that point and asked specifically for those who are categorized as living in rural areas, what are the difficulties that they're facing specifically? For example, transport will often index very highly for that group. Practical considerations of access and time, especially linked to that. And those are factors that will break out in the report. But there is certainly still a difference between urban and rural in terms of arts behaviours. What was pleasing is that when we look at the attendance figures in particular, the growth that we've reported isn't simply an urban or a metropolitan growth. We are seeing attendance increase in rural populations as well. So I think some of those good news stories that we've talked about today do traverse into both of those segments.
And does the 0.944% who talk about access to buildings as being an inhibitor, is that the availability of a building, a cultural building that's referenced in the word access?
I mean, there's going to be a researcher's get out clause here, which says that as posed, it is simply access. So it could be interpreted either way. What we do see, though, is that rural respondents are indexing very highly against those factors that are accessibility in the most general sense. Yeah. So it does suggest there's a cluster of factors there that are still particular inhibitors for a rural population.
I think one of the big differences between 2006 and now is the growth of rural arts centres. You know, there has been a huge increase in that period of time, and I think that there's a very interesting investigation to do there. But also that TGI has a category which is called other urban. And so large towns would be gathered within the other urban category. So it's not strictly necessarily urban, i.e. Dublin, Cork, Galway and Limerick, and then the rest. So there's a degree of sophistication in what we can do in looking at the growth since the public and the arts in those centres, and also how that relates to the categories of rural and other urban.
Yeah, and yeah, just to confirm, we would measure Dublin, but we'd certainly measure what we'd call the old style county boroughs as well. So we are able, to a relative degree of detail, to talk about specific types of geography. And there is differences in analysis to be had there. You know, even within Dublin, we see different constituencies, and the data will show those off.
Thank you. Now, there's a lady there in the front. Yeah.
Sherwin Arts Officer at Wicklow County Council. Just as someone who's involved in the creation of high quality participatory experiences and the advocacy for them, will the study reveal the type of activity that participation in the arts is likely to result in? So for example, if someone is involved in youth theatre, is it likely that they will go to theatre events? Is there, and for another reason also, just in terms of providing progression pathways for them once they've had that experience, it would be useful to know.
What it will do is allow us to compare so to look at the correlations between participation in a particular activity and indeed attendance in that same sphere. So I know that's a question that Martin asked when we were looking at the brief for this study. You know, people participating in amateur drama are those people who are going to plays. And that is something, so that initial question, that is something we can answer in this study. That's probably as far as the study as is goes. So we can't necessarily speak to, firstly, sort of how that correlation is driven, but also its kind of output and outcomes.
Yeah, I think also we're running up against, I mean, the great advantage of TGI is that it's like a combine harvester. The scale of it, it really harvests big stuff, and it's all related to other, but you know, you also need a sickle to get into those micro questions. And I think probably the ideal thing would be a combination of that combine harvester with focus group work, where you would begin to get at whether it's disability or family behaviors or, you know, the kind of correlation between participation. I mean, that's, in an ideal world, obviously that comes with human resources and financial resources to underpin that. So probably, as Chris said in answer to a previous question, to some extent this raises as many questions as it addresses and answers. But it gives us in the Arts Council and in arts audiences, you know, the sort of basis upon which one might actually pursue particular agendas in a micro way.
If I could just to speak to that point as well, we have had good success in TGI in running separate qual or segmentation studies, which feed back into the general population study. So not to do a sales pitch, but just to say there is definitely a role for more specialist surveys, but then getting back to that helicopter view periodically.
Very good. Okay, John.
John Fanning, the Arts Council. You gave us one or two comparative figures for Northern Ireland and the UK. Do you have any other pan-European comparison figures? Because if you go to the Minister for Finance and you say 80% of the Irish population think the arts are the greatest thing in society, his eyes are going to glaze over. If you say that 80% is double the European average, then you've got the start of a case.
We certainly on attendance have a reasonably consistent set of questions that are deployed in certainly all the markets that I would work on. So as Emer mentioned earlier, we've got data for the big four, big five European nations. The coda to that is there are always subtle differences in each market in terms of how the arts are measured and recorded. And as a researcher, therefore, I tend to attach certain riders to those comparisons. We do, though, see that in the Republic of Ireland, attendance is consistently higher on an event by event, a direct comparison basis. So if I take GB or if I take Germany at the moment, what we've seen or what we appear to have seen in our survey is something slightly more stable and static over the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen in some of the Latin markets, and I think particularly of Spain, that actually the recessionary influence seemed to be deeper. And actually, therefore, the regrowth in the last 1 or 2 years has been much more pronounced, much more significant. So I think some of those comparisons are there. And I take the point that actually with a lot of these figures, what's important is context. And hopefully we can give you some of that.
Very good. Yes, please. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. So can I encourage anybody who has a burning question or somebody who's of a nervous disposition and hasn't quite got the courage to grab the mic, please grab the mic. That's what we're here for.
Hi, Aaron Little, Peter Royal in Waterford.
My question is about place and setting, that very few people go to dedicated centres but are likely to use public spaces. Could you expand on that a bit more, because I'm a bit depressed about it?
I was going to say, firstly, I think we've some coverage of particular named destinations in the study, so we check the questionnaire after this session to see what we do have. I think one of the limitations in that question is, to an extent, it will overstate the most significant venues. So I think one of the comparisons we'll certainly do, and we're doing as part of this report, is looking therefore at the named level detail, and to make sure that we see the richness that is there. I mean, there's certainly some good data this year around those named venues, especially.
It's also true that theatres they came out quite strongly. And you can imagine that somebody filling out a survey might tick the theatre box rather than something saying arts centre.
Well, yeah,
if
there is a certain limitation to asking the AN other, that it doesn't necessarily draw as significant a response. And that's one of the reasons we've started to have named destinations or venues, simply because there's a much greater likelihood of a very clear response for those. So we'll certainly check the questionnaire.
But there's also a relationship, isn't there, between the nature of the venue and the fact that an event could be within the amateur or community or professional domain, so that it's not necessary. I mean, we in this room would be focused, obviously, and are likely to get depressed because we're thinking from within the professional paradigm. But attendance, that's where churches and school halls and community centres would probably have a much greater profile within that semi-professional or non-professional area. So I think it's important to remember that. Okay, so we're probably into the last 2 or 3. So the urgent hand, there's an urgent hand there. Thank you.
Hi, Heather Maitland from the UK. We had an issue with taking part in the arts, which is our government survey. We had areas where there was very high ticket sales through our benchmarking. Ticket sales, very low attendance according to taking part in the arts. And it was because we did some follow-up research. It's because the question said, have you been to a theatre or concert hall? And in these areas, what they had was art centres, and they weren't counting that because the question said theatre and concert hall.
Thanks,
Just to say, I think that's a very useful observation. I know that study obviously has been conducted within Kantar for a long time, and that's the sort of takeaway that we can use to enrich all of our studies. So I appreciate you raising it.
Great. I'm scanning the room. I'm seeing no more hands. It's the hands on the clock are saying 5 to 11, and Una Carmody is just going to give you 1 or 2 quick housekeeping notes before we move to coffee. Thank you very much, and particularly thank you to Chris.
Okay, great. Now, in the interest of getting through the day, and Martin, I'm deeply impressed by the fact that we've actually finished the session on time. And in the interest of getting through the day, there is now a short 15-minute break. There are now 3 parallel sessions about to start, and their locations are on the back of your badge. So the Latouche room is just opposite where you registered, and the President's room is up the 1 flight of stairs, okay? I would really like to urge people, and then there's a session in here. There are 3 options. The session in here consists of 2 separate 1-hour sessions, and it'll finish at 1:15. So if you stay here, what you will get is a session on internal advocacy, what Orla was referring to earlier, how to advocate for marketing and audience development in your organization, followed by a fascinating investigation of the Mapping Your Audience tool that the Arts Council has produced for, is it 73 venues around Ireland, which will allow you to look at your catchment area. So that's quite a large, chunky session, and it'll finish at 1:15. For the others, you are encouraged, and I really would encourage people to do 2 things. If there's more than 1 person here from your organization, do split up and try and cover as much ground as you can. And also, if you're not directly involved in visual arts or literary festivals, what I would also say to you is that those benchmarking projects are absolutely fascinating. And one of the reasons we're doing this in this format today, rather than what we've done previously, which is have a separate day for literature and a separate day for visual arts, is that we really hope we can cross-fertilize the different art forms, that people will be as interested in finding out about audiences for visual arts. Particularly, we have a really strong representation here today from multidisciplinary venues. So I'd really urge you actually to, if you're looking at that and going, now I really want to go to that one, give the others a thought and see. And as I said, for all of the technical instruction sessions, we will be podcasting those. So if you're saying to yourself for later on, you know, I'm definitely going to go to the how to use social media session, that will be podcast next week. So you could conceivably go to something else instead. Once again, in the interests of getting the day moving, there is coffee at the break this afternoon because we thought you all might fall asleep, but there's no coffee now. We want you to move and get to your sessions. We're going to start on time. I am the coffee Nazi, and I want. Oh, that's got a bigger reaction than anything else. So Chris is here until lunchtime. He's here for the day. So if you have questions, I'd ask you to buttonhole him. I think there'll be a very long queue. And thank you all very much indeed. We'll see you back here after lunch. Enjoy the next session.